Susan
Okay,
Tran and
hey,
Helen.
guys.
Right.
So great. I recognize some of you, but not all of you. So it looks like there's a lot of new people who are interested in this subject. Let me introduce myself. I'm Marilee Massa. I am president of the Colorado Community Rights Network. I was involved and active in the Community Rights Ballot Initiative in Lafayette that we passed in 2013 that banned fracking in the city of Lafayette. And so is one of the other speakers here. And I am also on city council now. By the way, there is another city councilor in the room, Gustavo Reina over there. So I'm going to give you a little introduction about what we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to introduce the other two speakers, one of which I know very well and one pretty well. Here's what's happening. We want to do kind of an overview of what's happening in Boulder County right now with the Boulder County Commissioners. This is related to oil and gas extraction. And certainly we all know that a number of communities passed bans on oil and gas extraction. Longmont and Fort Collins went to the Supreme Court and they were told that you cannot do this. So here's where we are. Is this going to be the end of it? And the answer is no, it is not going to be the end of it. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Boulder County now and how we've worked up to this stage, what the overarching issues are, where we want to go from here, and then we want to talk about this in terms of kind of a national issue as well, because there's bigger things going on here than just what's happening locally in Boulder. This is applicable, by the way, what's happening here is certainly applicable in Denver, Adams, Larimer, Weld, all the other counties that are facing this in Colorado, in Oregon, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and other states that have had the same issues with the same kinds of corporate assaults on their community. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker, and this is Cliff Wilming. Some of you probably already know him. I know him very well because he happens to be my son. I know we don't look alike at all. Cliff was also very active in the Community Rights Ballot Initiative in Lafayette when we passed it in 2013 by Citizen Initiative. He's been very involved in that. He's been involved in the statewide Community Rights Network. We also tried to do ballot initiatives statewide to give communities control over this issue. We did that in 2014 and again in 2016. And that's a slog. He was involved in that. He's been at Standing Rock. He's a nurse himself. He has 2 children, which means I have 2 grandchildren. And he's the first speaker. Our second speaker I know quite well too. This is a man that we worked with very closely when we created the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights that banned fracking. This is Thomas Lindsay, who is Executive Director of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund out of Pennsylvania. I knew him as a voice on the phone 3 or 4 years ago when we were working on our ballot initiative. And we said we want to do more in Lafayette than just say we want to ban fracking, we want a moratorium. We want this to be a rights issue. We want to say we are banning this as a violation of our rights in our community. And so we started working with Thomas. Thomas works with the National Community Rights Effort. He's based in Spokane now. He's worked in Spokane, Washington. He's worked with groups in Pennsylvania. He's been doing this for how many years, Thomas?
Too many.
Too many years. And so he'll be speaking as well. He can fill you in a little more. We're going to do a little conversation about what the background is in Boulder County and what we've dealt with. And then Thomas is going to talk a little bit about, community rights and their involvement, Boulder County, how it affects the state, what's gone on in other states. We'll have a little question and answer session, so bring up your questions, and then we'll have a wrap up, and we'll be out of here by the time the library closes. So thank you so much for coming.
All right, this is a pretty big group, so if it's okay, I'm going to get a selfie with you guys right now. Is that all right? Yeah. And then we'll see if we can even get you in the camera here. But Oh, that's huge. Okay, ready? 1, 2, and 2, 3. Awesome.
Are you going to tag the Boulder County Commissioners?
I think they're aware of the presence of this meeting today. Again, my name is Cliff Wilming. I'm a Lafayette resident here. Myself and my family, we moved out here about 7 years ago from Chicago. I've got a bit of a background in political activism, but really we came out here to Colorado just due to the clean environment and transparent politics. And so if you trust my political instinct at this point, you might want to rethink that. So in any case, my job here today is those of us in Lafayette that have been fighting very, very strongly against the oil and gas industry for the last 5 years. This has been an ongoing war that has been extremely dynamic, and there's been some extremely steep learning curves to that. Most folks know that the Supreme Court, of course, this last year said that it was entirely against our authority to ban oil and gas activity, and so some developments have taken place between then and now that are alarming to us as community members here in Lafayette, certainly to myself as a father of 2 young kids. And so really what I kind of want to do is I want to get behind this issue a little bit, kind of start to talk about where we stand today, and just really start to reform a narrative around oil and gas development. Because I think that we've never really addressed it from a perspective of rights. We've tried to, but that narrative has kind of been pushed aside for some years, and that's got to kind of reassert itself going forward. So I want to how many people here would say that they're very familiar with oil and gas development in Boulder County over the last 5 years? Okay, so about half, so that's good. We wanted to speak to everybody. We've got very new people here, and we've got people, Mandy and Rick, some of the originals. It's great to see you guys. I'm going to do a very brief history or chronology of oil and gas development here in Boulder County from about 2011 to 2016. I'm going to talk about kind of where we are right now and propose some possible tasks ahead. For those of us not just in Lafayette, but all of us in Boulder County. Back in 2011, very few people in Boulder County had really understood what fracking was. Right now, as we speak, we've got a bit over about 90 wells in Boulder County. Here in Lafayette, we've got about 14 wells. When we first started the initial campaign to ban fracking here in Lafayette, we actually went to the prior city council, and they didn't even know how many wells were in existence in their own town. Which doesn't necessarily mean that the council was unable to understand that. It's simply that the municipalities are so totally alienated from any kind of decision making that there's really very little impetus to get local communities to weigh in on it. But that kind of shows you how barren it was back then. Back in 2011, the discussion around hydraulic fracturing was quite different than we understand it today. So given a fairly large public relations campaign of the oil and gas industry, some very select environmental organizations that were loyal to that process, and due to the political players in Colorado, back in 2011, oil and gas or fracking in particular, was understood as a method of creating methane, which would be used as a bridge fuel to a fossil fuel-free world. That was the talking point of fracking. The real big environmental dominant voices kind of weighed in, and they said, well, okay, this is good, methane burns cleaner, but we need tight regulations to make this technology safe for people. The oil and gas industry understood that there would be a backlash from communities, and so they had to embed this within a fairly sophisticated public relations campaign, and that's essentially what it was. If you look at the Sierra Club material from 2011, you will always hear this term bridge fuel or safely regulated fracking, all of that kind of stuff. And that was essentially it. Whether we should continue to burn fossil fuels, who should be the ultimate decision makers of whether Boulder County got blown up by a bunch of wells, those were all very intentionally removed from the conversation. And there's a reason, because if we start talking about things in terms of rights or who's making the decision about these fuels, it starts to take on a very different element. You'll notice, if those of you that have been brave enough to torture yourself through Facebook debates on oil and gas development, if you get up onto the Creed Facebook page, and what you'll notice every time we want to start talking about fracking, they want to talk about parts per billion of benzene, safe casings, regulating the process, and all that sort of thing. When you start talking about rights, they start throwing around terms like tyranny of the majority, right? Which, of course, is our alternative to the current formation, which is tyranny of the minority, which we all are living under right now. So that conversation was intentionally omitted from the original discussion on oil and gas activity. 2012 started to change things. 2012 was when you had a significant amount of explosions, leaks, spills, and all of these other elements that people started to become very familiar with that go hand in hand with oil and gas development. And right around 2012, the conversation started to change a bit, because it was no longer about banning fracking or about regulating fracking. People started to talk about banning fracking altogether. And right about that summer of 2012, there was a fairly large explosion right around Fort Lupton that actually killed an Encana worker and sent 3 to the hospital. And right at that time, the spokesperson from Encana had issued some quote. Her name was Wendy Weidenbach, if those of you who remember her. About a week before that explosion, she said that Boulder County would be drilled with the same degree of safety and responsibility that Weld County is being drilled. 1 week later was that explosion. So there were all these kind of confluences that were starting to weigh into the oil and gas question, as well as the question that nobody seems to really get a whole big grip of, which is of course, is climate change itself, which oil and gas is a direct contributor to that. There's no way, if these fuels are burned, which is their inherent purpose, they will add to a catastrophic amount of climate change. So there's all of that. 2012 as well is when we had Longmont. That even after they started threatening lawsuits from the Colorado Oil and Gas Association and Governor John Hickenlooper, Longmont said that what they wanted to do was ban the technology of hydraulic fracturing, all right? And when they enacted that ballot initiative, what the legal strategy was yes, of course, this might be preempted by the state, but if we narrow in, if we're clever enough to narrow in on that technology versus saying, hey, we don't want any dam drilling here under any circumstances, maybe we can avoid that frontal confrontation of state preemption and all those bigger corporate legal powers that they have. Everybody here now knows it's history that Longmont enacted that ban. It was somewhat a first of its kind, but it started to change the tone of this whole effort. I don't know if anybody remembers when John Hickenlooper came to Longmont in 2012. That was kind of like, there's some revolutionary shots were fired that night because Longmont had invited Hickenlooper to come in and speak to the public. He refused to do so and met with the Colorado Chamber of Commerce up there in Longmont. And at the end of the night, he made the mistake of exiting that meeting through the crowd of about 300 people. Who accosted him like a bunch of serfs in some kind of feudal uprising, and literally chased John Hickenlooper into his car and sent him on his way. And so we gained all the right lessons from that stuff in Lafayette, which was like, we no longer have to cooperate with this stuff. We no longer have to bow our heads. We no longer have to negotiate better terms of surrender to the oil and gas industry. It's about time that we start to define for ourselves the rights that we hold valuable and address this issue of oil and gas development as an inherent transgression on those rights. Those of you that were here in 2013 is when we did our Lafayette Community Bill of Rights that passed with over 60% of the popular vote. A lot of people consider that Community Bill of Rights a ban on fracking, which it is. But Lafayette really threw the entire schematic aside, and much thanks to the people at the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund for raising our expectations. The Lafayette Community Bill of Rights not only bans fracking, it bans all extraction of all fossil fuels. It bans the disposal of associated industrial wastes, and it bans the creation of all extractive infrastructure in Lafayette, including pipelines. So right now, everyone that's in this building right now, you are in the home of the most comprehensive ban on fossil fuels in Colorado state history. So I want to give Lafayette a little props for that. Now, throughout the course of that campaign, we did not approach it from a position of naivete. We did not come into it thinking that we were going to ban fracking in Lafayette and the rest of the story would be happy, rainbow, that kind of stuff. We knew that we were being threatened with lawsuits. We knew why we were being threatened by those lawsuits, under what legal premises we're being threatened. And our position of the Lafayette the effort for that ban on fracking was that the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights was in essence an act of legal civil disobedience. And I want to stress that because a lot of times when we were out there doing the petitioning, it was very difficult to say, look, the system is not broken, the system is fixed. It's running perfectly according to design. And fracking being forced and mandated into Lafayette is the exponent of that system. And what we're saying is we don't care what your opinion is. We're banning fracking here in Lafayette because we're going to ultimately have to defend that Community Bill of Rights. So it was kind of a tough argument to make at the time, and a lot of times what people just heard is, you want to get rid of fracking? And they say, oh yeah, sure. And we would try to say, there's kind of more to this that will come down the line. But we did that. We were obviously outspent by the oil and gas industry. It was a tremendous victory for us in Lafayette, and we would like more communities to create community bills of rights to embed that. Of course, we didn't know how long it would be or if we would get sued. Of course, it was about 3 weeks until the lawsuit landed in Lafayette, which of course gave rise to a ton of those state ballot initiatives that you heard. The Colorado Community Rights Amendment was the one that we worked on, which, as Marilee talked about, really started to go right after the heart of the discrepancy between corporate power and the rights of communities and people where we live. It is a broad measure that doesn't delineate just fracking, because corporations enjoy a very broad spectrum of rights over communities, and we didn't want to sequester it to just fracking, because as some of you may know, Lafayette is preempted from creating a living wage here that is higher than the states. As some of you may know, we are preempted from banning GMOs. We are preempted from creating rent control for affordable housing. So all of these things are laws that are created by the 1% to suppress the 99%, because if everything went to a vote, the 99% would tend to win. And that's why this stuff doesn't go for a vote. Within the course of this stuff, and which is what we're going to focus here today, we had a much larger problem, a difficult situation with Boulder County as a whole. Because, as you may know, Lafayette is a home rule community, Boulder is a home rule community, and Longmont is a home rule community. So all of us could create these charter amendments where we could put this stuff to a vote for people to amend our home rule charter. But Boulder County is a statutory community, which means that you don't have the option to do that. The county commissioners can put things onto the ballot, but regardless, despite our best attempts, we've never convinced the county commissioners to put fracking to a direct vote of the people, and you probably know why. Because it invites that confrontation. It invites that confrontation that they're not, at this stage, interested in executing. So throughout the course of Boulder County, there has been a virtual cat and mouse game between the people and the county commissioners, as well as the governor and the oil and gas industry. Boulder County's last fracked well, the big hydrofracked Halliburton technology well, was in 2012. Boulder County has been fracked. You can frack on the open space. There's a lot of kind of myths about this. But Boulder County is just as susceptible to hydraulic fracturing as any other place in the country. And within the course of that, the county commissioners started to enact regulations. They started to basically embody that narrative that we talked about that said, well, we can't ban fracking here in Boulder County, but we can really regulate it very stringently, and hopefully within the course of that, that will be a satisfactory conclusion to the citizens and the environment and all of that sort of thing. During those initial days, that was the conversation, is that we need very good regulations. And a growing group of us in Boulder County that were also fighting here on the home front at Lafayette essentially split our attention between the county and Lafayette. And what we brought to the county was this idea that no, actually, well-regulated fracking, an acceptable level of benzene in the air is kind of a non-starter to us. And within the course of that, we were confronted by many of the traditional environmental efforts and people that wanted to maintain a nice relationship with the county commissioners. And they said, well, if you go down that road, you are going to be disrupting everything that we've done. And we said, well, in our perspective, everything that's been accomplished has landed over 20,000 wells in Weld County, and so we feel that the business model needs to change now. In December of 2013, the Boulder County Commissioners at their meeting were going over the final touches for the oil and gas regulations by which they could start accepting permits. How many people here know what a mic check is?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Mic check.
Mic check. Right. So we got it here. This is kind of, I'm sure Occupy did not invent this strategy, but this is kind of a call and respond chant that has the effect of being extremely disruptive. And at that meeting, a woman who happens to be my wife, actually, she stood up and started to make these statements about, under any circumstances, Boulder County will not be drilled. We will not accept a well-regulated fracking. Our rights are primary to the rights of Encana and the corporations. And of course, you've got 300 people in the room repeating everything that she's saying. So it was a thunderous refutation of the plan that the Boulder County Commissioners had. The Boulder County Commissioners were very, very upset. They actually walked out of the chambers of the County Commission meeting, at which point, how many people here know who the Earth Guardians are?
Oh, yeah.
So they're badass. Yeah, so all of the Earth Guardians, which are a youth group, the environmentalists in Boulder, went and took the place of the county commissioners that night. And after we had enjoyed owning, imagine people owning their governmental meetings. It was very contentious. And then I put a resolution to the floor and I said, Chairman, can we get a vote on fracking here tonight? And so, of course, Shatesket, who was, I think, all of 13 years old, acting as chair, said, how many people here want to ban fracking in Boulder County? And of course, every hand in the room went up in the air. That started to change the tone of all of Boulder County. Because what it meant to the county commissioners is that those reasonable adult-like people that were going to cooperate with fracking and the regulations and all that sort of thing, suddenly were no longer at the helm of all of this. And this new group, or these new people, had started to step forward with a very different idea how we were going to conduct ourselves in contrast to the oil and gas industry, and of course in contrast to the system that expects our cooperation. Later in 2013, the Boulder County Commissioners voted unanimously to end the moratorium on new gas permits. Those of us in Lafayette had predicted that from a very long time. A lot of people were very demoralized. A lot of people were very disillusioned when that took place. A lot of folks thought that the county commissioners, under no circumstances, would ultimately allow fracking in Boulder County. So at that point, we created a community meeting that had about 300 people in it. It was down at the Unity Church in Boulder. And we started to organize nonviolent civil disobedience trainings and a recall effort. And we honestly, at that point, were not doing it to influence the county commissioners. We were doing it as a means of self-defense. That's the way we looked at it then. Interestingly enough, 3 weeks after the civil disobedience training started, the county commissioners reconvened and totally reversed their decision on ending the moratorium on oil and gas permits. Of course, they were very clear in that meeting that the people's opinion had nothing to do with their behavior, which I think is an interesting perspective from an elected official to vocalize anyway. That's another conversation. But so at that point, we started into Boulder County, and we started into this new moratorium, and into this chapter basically where we understood that if Boulder County was going to be protected, if our families were going to be protected, if our schools and our homes and our communities, it would likely not come from the elected officials. It likely would not come from, thank you. It would likely not come from big celebrities. It would likely not come from the Sierra Club or, Barack Obama. That we had to do it ourselves. And that's a very compelling thing for any normal law-abiding suburbanite like all of us here to really confront. And over the course of the next year, that's essentially what took place. I'm gonna wrap it up here by just a conversation, a small kind of discussion on where we are right now within Boulder County. Because after that Supreme Court decision, the Boulder County commissioners have since in the last 6 months ended the moratorium that should have gone through 2018 and are now going back into those regulatory hearings so that oil and gas permits can eventually arrive here and Boulder County can be drilled. What does that mean for us as community members? According to the Boulder County government, that would mean as much as 1,800 oil and gas wells in Boulder County. Most people say 18, and I say no, 1,800. That's their figures. Right here.
Is that 1,800 well pads?
I believe it's 1,800 wells.
Okay.
So,
because I know, a well pad can have up to 20 wells. 24 wells. So.
Yeah, and the thing is that not only would it be 1,800 wells, not only would those 1,800 wells be fracked, but they could also be fracked up to 17 times. For those of you technical buffs out there, the frack operation takes about 12 million gallons of water. So that's one well. So if we do believe water is life, which I think we do know that, fracking is death. And so that's essentially where we've kind of arrived today is we've got the Boulder County commissioners down there at the courthouse who have now opened up this process yet again. I think to some extent that we're a victim of our own success because we've been able to keep oil and gas drilling out of Boulder County for 4 years. And granted, that's because of people like you. That's not because John Hickenlooper said it was okay. And it's not because Encana decided that there was nothing worthwhile here. That was done as it's the embodiment of the political force that we created. So we have reconvened here in Lafayette. The original group that we did the Community Bill of Rights was East Boulder County United. We've reconvened here in Lafayette, many of us from around the county, but only a small handful so far, to discuss what the next phase of this will be. Because ultimately what we're seeing is that we've kicked the can down the road so long that at some stage, and potentially as soon as next month, the permit on oil and gas activity will end. And the Boulder County Commissioners will then start to accept new permits for drilling. And what we're here to discuss today, and until we win a decisive victory that permanently bans fracking for all times in Boulder County, is we have to start talking about how the defense and the protection of Boulder County looks. It's not going to take place by us appealing to the county commissioners. They've already heard it. They know the arguments, they know the statistics, and they know the laws. And right now the county commissioner is going to have to ask themselves whether they want to become law enforcement agencies for the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, or they want to join us in a new people's movement. And I don't use that term lightly. I want to say the way we define movement here in Lafayette is when a group of people understands that the system is rigged and starts to break the laws that chain us to our own demise with the intent to do so as to protect our people. That's a very compelling conversation, and we want to open it up for discussion. We also want to hear from Thomas Lindsay here, but I wanted to give a bit of a background of kind of where we all are. It's very compelling, kind of scary talk, but Also looking at the general political climate of this country, I don't think we're alone in that. I think that looking in terms of protecting ourselves from the oil and gas industry, anybody that has looked or seen Standing Rock, the events that are taking place up in Standing Rock, we're not alone in that either. So thank you very much. We'll do a discussion after Thomas speaks, and then Thomas and I will wrap up for about 5 minutes or something like that. So everybody please thank us for bringing in Thomas Lindsay.
So I'm going to talk for a couple minutes, and then I think we want to get to the meat of the what next. And Cliff said something very important, which is that you're not alone. And I think that's very important to know. Over the past 15 years across the United States, there's been an awakening of sorts. It's been very slow. It's been the slowest for the people who have been in the middle of it for the past 15 years. But the awakening that's happened across the United States is, in a nutshell, an understanding that we don't live in a democratic system. And a lot of people say those words. You know, the past 15 years have been meaning, we don't live in a democracy, this is a democracy. But very few people have understood, have inherently understood why we don't live in a democracy and how the mechanics of our system actually function. Because it's one thing to say we don't live in a democracy, it's another thing to understand why and how that happens. And in the United States today, because you're part of the bigger system, you're part of this federal system that we have in the United States, that the law that governs you here in Boulder County is the same law that governs people in Grant Township, Pennsylvania, or in Waterville, Ohio, or in the small rural counties in Oregon, or in Northern California. It's the same system of law. And as we all have learned in high school or college or law school or whatever, the system operates the same way. The federal trumps the state, and the state trumps the local. And in fact, the even more terrifying concept about the federal and state and local relationship is that because the local government level, the municipal government level, the level of government closest to us, is not even recognized in the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution recognizes the relationship between the federal government and the state government only. It doesn't even mention municipal governments or local governments. That you've pretty much been the stepchild to U.S. constitutional law and politics over the past 200 years. Because you're not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, your municipality, and you by default as being a resident of that municipality, have no constitutional rights of local self-government. Okay? So the U.S. Constitution, while it defines the relationship between the federal and the state, because it doesn't mention local governments and doesn't mention people in their own local governments having the authority to actually determine locally what happens there, that you've been forgotten. And because that vacuum has existed, other forces have jumped in to fill it. And the forces that have jumped in to fill it include your state government, the Colorado state government, the Colorado legislature, the state legislature here, which under current systems of law, as any lawyer will tell you that's schooled in the traditional current system of law, has plenary power over you, that the state legislature governs you. If they chose tomorrow to eliminate Boulder County as a county, they have the legal authority to do that. They can change the rules under which you operate. They can merge you with another county. They can merge municipalities within the county with other municipalities without your permission or authority. They have plenary authority over you in Boulder County. Okay? The general rule to describe that relationship is called Dillon's rule. It's something we get into within our 2-day trainings that we do for community activists, lawyers, and municipal officials. Dillon's rule essentially is the understanding that you, living in a municipality, a city, a town, a county, a village, whatever, are a creature of the state. That you are a child and the state is the parent, and the parent can do whatever it chooses to do with you. Okay? This is one of the most terrifying concepts in the law that so many people fundamentally misunderstand. That we have no rights within our own communities to make things that are at odds, to make laws that are at odds with the state. That's conventional, traditional law. What does that mean from an organizing perspective? Well, if you're large enough economically to control the factors used by the state legislature to decide lawmaking, you can completely rule and govern opposite to the wants and needs of the people within the municipalities that are completely within and under your state control. Okay? So Dillon's rule is one side of the coin, preemption is the other. Preemption is when the state says you shall not do X. So in your oil and gas acts, the state legislature has chosen to preempt you from banning oil and gas extraction with your communities. That's a value judgment made by your state. Your state has said it is more important that certain interests be placed over your interests in Boulder County because we are going to divest you of the authority to decide what happens in your own county. And we're going to give that power to other entities that want to, in this case, exploit Boulder County for certain resources. So we have to be clear right off the bat that this awakening that's happened over the past 15 years has essentially been people saying to themselves, it doesn't matter whether we elect new people to our city council. It doesn't matter whether we elect good people to be our county commissioners. They are stuck within a system of law that is 150 years old, that was built in some ways very carefully to keep you insulated from making major decisions about what happens to the place that you live. Okay, that's the system. So you have preemption, which is the state legislature saying you shall not do this. And you guys are intimately familiar with preemption from the fracking and oil and gas issues in the state. Dillon's rule is the flip side of that coin, which is that you shall not be able to make any law that the state legislature doesn't specifically authorize you to make. So Dillon's rule says if we don't give you the power as a state to specifically make a specific piece of legislation or to make law to do a certain thing, you automatically can't. There's a vacuum that you can't. There's a final doctrine that controls you in this room as residents of Boulder County and your municipality, and it's called corporate rights. Corporations today have constitutional rights in the United States. They've been carefully bestowed upon corporations over the past 150 years. Corporations today have the same rights and powers for the most part that you do as a human being. They have First Amendment rights, which allowed them recently, relatively recently, in the Citizens United case, to overturn campaign finance law instituted and implemented by Congress, by federal law, holding that campaign finance laws violate corporate free speech rights under the First Amendment because corporations are persons under the law. Corporations also have Fifth Amendment rights, which prevent you from interfering with their property. Because if you interfere with corporate property within Boulder County, you owe them money for the value of the property that you've interfered with. Because the Fifth Amendment is about paying them just compensation for whatever property has been taken from them. So what does all this have to do with you? Well, you've run into these doctrines, even if you don't know it, because when communities are sued by corporations, when they go outside this box that's been carefully built for them, and they ban oil and gas extraction, for example, the first thing that happens is an oil and gas corporation files suit against your community. And they file suit against your community using those three legal doctrines. First, they say you're preempted because the state has preempted you. Second, they say you have no authority to pass what you passed in the first place because of Dillon's rule. You've never been given the authority by the state legislature to pass that in the first place. And third, you violated our corporate constitutional rights because we have a permit to drill in your community and your local law prohibits us from exercising our permit rights, which is property under the law. And you owe us not just for the value of that permit, but for future value of the permit. In other words, the amount of the oil and gas that you've prohibited us from taking out of the ground. Legally, they have the power to hold your municipality liable for the value of the oil and gas that you've prevented them from taking, right? That is the law. That is the law. And parts of it have been very carefully concocted over the past 150 years to lay different sections down to further insulate you and divest you from having any kind of democratic authority in your community to make these kinds of decisions. So this awakening over the past 15 years has been to come to grips with that. To understand that it's not enough just to say we don't have a democracy. The question is, how does that operate? How have we been stripped of these things? How is the system set up? How do we dismantle that system? And we can't dismantle it until we know how it's structured. We are such an obedient people in the United States. We are obedient unto death. That's what we are. We are obedient unto death, right? So most of the activism in this country has been about working around that system. It's been about trying to find ways to regulate different parts. In other words, cause a little less harm from the projects that are coming into our communities. How do we regulate them? How do we place them differently? How do we use zoning ordinances to sacrifice only part of our community but not other parts of our community? How do we try to find loopholes in the laws to crawl around preemption and Dillon's rule and corporate rights instead of taking them on directly? Instead of saying these are illegitimate because they divest us of our right to govern ourselves locally. And that old democracy stuff that's also in the Colorado state constitution that says people are the source of all governing authority in the United States. But somehow that's just not quite true in your own community or municipality. We have come to a point in time where people have spent 15 years, longer than that, exhausting their imagined remedies under the system. That we grow up inculcated in a system in which we hear things like consent of the governed and majority rules and all of this nice poetic language. So when one of our communities, a factory hog farm of 15,000 hogs comes into a community, people sit back and they say, well, they can't do that. Our community doesn't want that factory farm in our community. We live in a democracy, goddammit, and we have the right to say no to that coming in. Right? That's the initial response that people have when something comes in that's going to be harmful, or something that's going to, in this case, affect the climate, global warming, or water pollution, or whatever the harmful issue is. That our brain's coming to grips with the fact that we have a system that legalizes and enables the harm to come in. It doesn't stand on our side to stop the harm. It's been designed to actually enable the harm to occur. So when Cliff talks about the fact that people come up to him and say, well, the regulatory system is broken, because it won't protect us from these harms. The fact is the regulatory system isn't broken, it's working perfectly. It's working perfectly because it was never intended to protect health, safety, and welfare. It was intended to be a barrier between you and your own governmental system. It's intended to legalize harms. When a state agency writes a permit allowing a corporation to put 100 parts of benzene into the waterways, they are legalizing the harm. When they permit a frack well, they are legalizing the harm. Permits and regulations are not about stopping harms, they're about legalizing the harm to occur. So the question is, what do you do when you're stuck in a system that doesn't recognize your own authority to actually make decisions at the local level to stop that which is harming you? And not just stop what's harming you, but what's actually cooking the planet. Because whenever a new frack well goes in, whatever comes out of that frack well is guaranteed to be combusted. That's the purpose of pulling it out of the ground, is to combust it. And if we combust more fossil fuels, we are, of course, now at the very edge of the point of no return in terms of global change, global climate change, global warming, and the types of changes that brings. And so we really have to ask ourselves whether we're prepared to do a new kind of activism. And that new kind of activism first breached here in Lafayette. But that new kind of activism is about not turning to the existing institutions for a remedy. Understanding that those institutions are DNA'd to prevent you from obtaining a remedy through them. That not living in a democracy means actually grokking that understanding, taking it to heart, and saying, if we don't live in a democracy, why are we turning to the same political institutions to help us get out of what they've created in the first place, right? That's the key. And what does that new activism look like? Because it doesn't look like Facebook likes. And it doesn't look like signing petitions. And it doesn't look like the kinds of shit that we've been doing the past 40 years about begging and pleading regulatory agencies to do the right thing, or writing letters to Congress urging them to do something else. What does the new activism look like? And what's exciting is here, as much as it sucks, you're going to have an opportunity to pioneer that, right? Because you've been in a war already, You know, the last, what Cliff recounted, that's a war. You're in a war zone. You just haven't had to be on the exact front lines yet, receiving that fire, that cannon fire that other places have been in. You know, you've had temporary reprieves, which you guys struggled mightily to get into place in the first place. But you're about ready to be drilled. You're about ready to be drilled. It's coming. You know, nobody knows quite when, but it's coming. And the question is, what are you going to do about that? What does that new activism look like? And just to give you two quick examples of what activism has looked like in other places that we work, because we work intensively in about 10 states. We've assisted about 200 communities to do the kind of work that Lafayette did and has done here in Colorado. And we have a couple places that are becoming downright disobedient. And one of those places is a little place called Grant Township in Indiana County, Pennsylvania. It's a small community of about 1,000 people. And there was a proposal to bring a frack wastewater injection well into the community. These are the places where they dump all the produced water, the fracked water, the contaminated water. And by the way, many of the wells in Boulder, once they're done use as fracking wells, they simply reuse them as injection frack wastewater injection wells. So they inject the wastewater back into them for perpetuity. And 60% of them leak, and you get all that kind of good stuff that comes with it as well. In this one little township, they said, we're not going to do that. And the people folks there went to their township supervisors, their elected officials, and they said, we want you to pass this law that bans frack wastewater injection wells within the community, within a community rights frame. We have a right to clean air and clean water. We have a right to sustainable energy futures, and it doesn't include these frack wastewater injection wells. And their municipal officials passed it into law as a regular law. They then came under pressure from the oil and gas companies to repeal the law. And instead of repealing it, the folks in the community replaced their local elected officials, almost wholesale. They put their own activists into those elected official places. So that was a first step to keep the law from even being repealed. And then the oil and gas interests, unsuccessful in changing over the township supervisor so it was friendly to the oil and gas interests, then sued Grant Township in federal court, which is what happens. And guess what? The lawsuit was the same as everybody sees. The first is preemption. You're preempted by the Pennsylvania Oil and Gas Act. Second, Dillon's rule. Pennsylvania legislature has never given you power to regulate or control frack wastewater injection wells. And finally, number three, we are a corporation and we're suing you for damages stemming from us having to haul our produced water shit someplace else. So they filed for liability against the township for the monetary damages caused by not being able to put their injection well wastewater into that well that they were proposing to set up and inject in, but having to haul it to Ohio. The damage award was about $500,000 that they sought from the small municipality. What happens in most places? Well, they fold. Municipal officials fold. That's what happens. You're faced with bankruptcy in some places, so you fold. These new elected officials, because they were from the group itself, refused to fold. And they said, we're willing to go bankrupt. We are willing to go bankrupt as a municipality. The protection of our water here in the municipality is of importance enough for us to place that on the table. And so they went through this court action, and the judge overturned parts of their ordinance, including the ban on frack wastewater injection wells. And at that point, most municipalities would have folded. Most people would have gone home. But what they did instead was they began writing a home rule charter. And they said, fuck you to the judge, right? And they wrote a home rule charter that bans frack wastewater injection wells as part of a community bill of rights, right? And they withdrew corporate power and rights from the oil and gas corporations that were operating within their municipality. And they nullified preemption. They said preemption is only effective in certain circumstances, not when communities try to be more protective of health, safety, and welfare standards. And they nullified preemption, right? They stood up within this home rule charter to do it again and say, screw you to the judge. Well, they got sued again yesterday, right? Same municipality, same people. And now they're talking about the other component, which is if the courts are not going to enforce our right to local community self-government and to be free of harm, that we're going to do it ourselves. And now they're planning to do civil disobedience and direct action to actually block the roads. So the question again comes down to how badly do you want to stop the harm coming in? How far are you willing to go to do that? And what we find is, even with the language a lot of people use about I'm sitting down in front of the bulldozers, that a lot of people don't, because they're okay with moving away or doing something else and finding another way to avoid the harms. And the only other place I wanted to mention was Spokane, Washington, my home city, which is one place in the Pacific Northwest where all the coal and oil passing from the east, from the Bakken oil fields and the Powder River Basin, all the places where it's being extracted, crosses through the city of Spokane to get to the West Coast for export. And there's one bridge in the city of Spokane where it all passes. One single bridge, one single track. And people in Spokane put together a local law that would ban coal and oil from passing through the city. City Council voted to put it on the ballot for a vote of the citizenry this November. The railroad and oil and gas companies threatened to sue the city. The city backed down, pulled it from the ballot, taking it away from people to be able to vote on that initiative. The people refiled the initiative to then circulate themselves instead of the City Council putting it on the ballot. And then a group formed to actually do civil disobedience and direct action on the tracks to stop the coal and oil trains from rolling. There have been 12 arrests so far in the city of Spokane on a rolling civil disobedience direct action schedule that will continue through the rest of 2017, where people have said, we don't care anymore. We understand how this system functions. The system is about economic growth at all costs. It's about creating a set of rules to enable that growth to occur. And people have been coming to grips with an understanding and an awareness of how the system actually functions and the need to replace it with something else. And that's what they've been working on for the past 15 years. So here in Boulder County, we expect big things because you're on the receiving end of all that 15 years of knowledge and strategy and tactics. Because with an understanding and awareness of how the system actually operates, you are in a place where, as a reporter asked us when we were on a radio show this past week, she said, what other legal options are there available to the people of Boulder to stop oil and gas drilling? And we said, none. There's none. There's none anymore. It's gone. There's no legal options anymore, right? And sometimes that smashes into our foreheads pretty hard. But you have now been systematically divested of any remaining legal remedies that you possibly have. So your choice is either to change the system and do it with brute force and be courageous enough to do that route, or to sit back and get drilled. And that's really the only two choices that you have at this point.
I was just wondering if there's a path forward to ban fracking on a state level, like in New York, because that seems like that makes more sense.
Yeah, the stuff that's happened in New York, and for folks that don't know, there was a drive by local municipalities, small towns mostly, to ban heavy industrial use within their municipalities as part of their zoning ordinances. So we have to understand how limited the approach was in the first place, which is it can't apply to urban areas. It's only rural areas that are trying to actually preserve the rural quality of life in those rural areas, who put together land use plans that rule out all heavy industrial use within the town, and then ban it through the use of their zoning ordinance by outzoning that use. That it's very limited, the way that it's been done, but it has kept out oil and gas drilling from those areas. One of the difficulties is that in New York, they actually have a municipal Bill of Rights in their state constitution, which actually gives them some additional tools that you don't have here in Colorado. So that's the short answer. The other answer is that we don't think those bans are going to live very long. There's been a couple of towns already sued for damages because by banning, you're automatically taking away the oil and gas interests, and so corporate rights come into play, Fifth Amendment property rights. And so we think through a variety of circumstances that those bans are not going to be long-lived, but they emanate from land use planning stuff. They don't emanate from constitutional rights. And your question brought up another thing I meant to mention tonight, which was 2 weeks ago, most people don't even know about this, but a little group called Our Children's Trust, which is a group that has put some kids forward as plaintiffs in court actions to force state agencies to do something about climate change. They got a ruling in Oregon that was, ironically, not exactly what they wanted, but beneficial to the community rights area, which is a federal judge held for the first time that people in the United States have a right to climate as a federal constitutional right. And she put it on the same level as right to privacy. In other words, a fundamental constitutional right to climate. We think there's a lot of ways to use that in other ways, including legislatively. So I think perhaps, and we had a conversation this afternoon with the group here, that perhaps one of the options is to do a right to climate law, which actually attempts to leverage that right to climate, constitutional right stuff against fracking oil and gas drilling. But all to say, that's eventually a platform that has to build, but stopping it in the short term means working outside the courts and working outside the legislature.
We get this. Everything that you'll hear right now is can fall within the stages of grieving. The first thing that you hear is the denial. The county commissioners would never allow fracking in Boulder County. And then you get into bargaining. Maybe China will help us. Unfortunately, I kind of got stuck at the anger phase. I'm trying to be productive with that sort of thing. But ultimately, I mean, even these lawsuits, it's still hoping that a court or a judge or somebody other than us does the protective activities outside of us, and it defers a lot of our emphasis and power to people that we don't control. I think that the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund understands the legal fight as a component of a grassroots movement, which I think is a different way than to, like, for example, the lawsuits on Longmont and Fort Collins, where people were told very blatantly, well, these judges will decide morally. I mean, that's literally like as though the judges woke up one day and they based that decision on how they felt about it, rather than executing a very clear black letter law, which as we discussed, precludes us from that sort of thing. So, those are the kind of things. But yes, I think that from our perspective here, we've done everything within our means to do this. We have gone to our legislature. Mike Foote, who's a very nice guy that lives here in Lafayette, told us point blank, nothing will pass the legislature that oil and gas does not want passed. That's right. Period. So maybe they'll change their minds. I'm not in the position to overthrow the state legislature. Maybe we will be at some point. I think it's necessary. But it's just one of those things where I want to make sure that we understand that the real agents of change are sitting in this room right now. That's it.
Yeah.
Mr. Lindsay, if I understood you correctly, you said we have two options. The first option is to change the system. And the second option amounted to pass the hat, the cliffs fail.
Do what? That's
Who's fail?
Yeah. It's not doing it alone.
Have we thoroughly explored changing or / controlling the system? Mike Foote happens to be a leader in the state House of Representatives. Have we thoroughly investigated changing who our legislators are, who our governor is, who our federal people are? Wouldn't it be just as apropos to organize and use our efforts to make that change of our... Because after all, while I agree we don't live in a democracy, I think we live in a representative democracy.
Well, just speaking for myself, I'm done with that work. I mean, you're in a system of law that's constitutionally controlled, federally constitutionally controlled. So it doesn't matter that you change out state legislatures. You'd have to change them out with folks with different value systems, first of all, which has proven to be a failure, at least in my opinion, for the past 20 years. In fact, my home state, Pennsylvania, I can only think of one legislature that was elected in the entire 20 years I was there that actually shared my values or philosophy. So, that's kind of like asking the suffragists to change the legislatures or the abolitionists to change state legislatures instead of doing what they did. which is, I think the only option at this point is work outside, create the environment in which those legislatures operate. But you got to change the system itself. It's a system itself. It's a 1780s system of law that values certain property, economic, commerce interests over the rights of people, communities, and nature. The only way you're going to change that is actually to upend the thing. Otherwise, we're just playing with the knobs. I mean, we're not doing the real stuff.
Okay, my apology that I have to run, but I just wanted to tell you, I made a decision, and it's a personal decision, that my community is more important than my personal life. So what I'm getting from you is really the conclusion that I reached and the reason why I'm here, which is I'm going to stand in front of somebody who's going to end up shooting me perhaps, but I'm going to do that. And that's what I decided to do. And so rather than going into somebody might be able to help us, maybe, I want you to come up to your own personal decision, which is what I did. I'm going to be willing to stand there whatever I am, and somebody who might be my own state police might end up shooting me personally. But that life is less important to me than the community. And this is really the big fight we've had for years, right? Is it your personal liberty or the personal, or is it a community that will live in and we cooperate? So, I have to live and I have to run, but I want you to know that, because I think what you're asking us to do is what I decided to do. And I'm going to join in, and if we're going to have to hold hands and go against somebody, I just want you to count on me. That's who we are.
That's the Lafayette City Council.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry that I have to run, but yes, I'm with you.
Let's organize it and let's do it effectively, and I'll be right
You
there.
have to be smart about it, because that's what I need.
Yes.
But I'm there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo.
Thank you, Marilee. We're out there.
Thank you. There may be a third option that I'd like to throw out.
All right. We're still at the bargaining phase.
Hear me out. Right now, every city in this state roughly takes all the cash that you pay it in terms of taxes and fees, and they give that money to the Wall Street banks, okay? That money is fueling the fossil fuel industries, is fueling the military-industrial complex. It is the engine that is driving this planet to extinction. What I'm going to suggest is that we have another way. We can establish a public bank owned by the people in every city on the Front Range and take that money the way the Federal Reserve does and leverage it 10 times to pay those frackers to not frack in our community if that's what it takes. Because money is made out of nothing. It literally is made out of nothing. That's what they do. They just write it off and create it by creating a loan. So I suggest that we look at public banking as a way at least to empower local communities, cities, and counties to pay these fines if that's what it's going to be, and maybe save some lives and save people from having to frack their communities.
I think that's certainly an approach, but along with a powerful community going at something as well.
Yes.
And I think that's what we're talking
And
about.
I think we should say too, we would no sooner pay a fine to an oil and gas industry as we would compensate a slave owner for the expropriation of their slaves. So that's a non-starter. Our rights are not for sale, and they are also not to be bargained with. So the idea that we're going to somehow buy the shale from these folks and compensate them for not harming us, fuck that shit.
Well, don't overlook public banking. Very